So happy Tuesday.
We'll get started. Our next guest is Professor Robert Larame, who has come all the way from Swansea to say hello to you. And over to you, Bob.
Thank you very much for the invitation, Edmund. It's a pleasure and an honor to come and speak here today. I actually met Edmund back in 2006. So it's been a while, but thank you for staying in touch. How many people here are working on a literature survey? Has anybody started working on a literature survey yet? It's kind of a standard process in your first year of PhD studies. It's also called like a literature review, you know, getting familiar with the landscape of literature. How many people here have looked up some sort of guidelines that help you, like, give you some sort of guidance on this process? Has anybody looked up guidelines on how to do literature reviews and things like that? Yeah? So this will be a very interesting comparison between what you've read and what you see today, because they won't be exactly the same. And if anybody has any questions or comments, please interrupt. I would much rather have this be kind of a discussion or you know, a back and forth rather than me just talking the whole time. There is also a chance that I don't finish all the material on time. So I have a little bit of online resources to show you beforehand. So I have some training material on a YouTube channel. It's a data visualization YouTube channel, which has some training material. If you can type in my name on YouTube and then go to playlists, you'll find a playlist called the Doctoral Training Seminar Series. Whoops. And it has all sorts of interesting topics on it, like making the most of your meetings with your supervisor, like how to have an effective meeting, how to read scientific research papers, strategies for reading, and then how to write scientific literature surveys, how to structure and write scientific papers, visual data analysis, and there are lots of topics on there. So if you're interested in learning more and seeing related material, it's all there. I also worked hard on something called the PhD in Visualization Starter Kit. So that's my background, is in data visualization. But a lot of the material is applicable across all computer science. So the PhD in Visualization Starter Kit, or PVSK, has its own web page, and it has its own documentation, like the minutes of meeting protocol that we use during supervisory meetings, a PDF document on how to read visualization papers that applies generally across the board, how to write visualization papers, including surveys. So for today, this PDF will be a very, you know, interesting resource. And there are some other things there too, like coding conventions. So if you're developing software, it's a good idea to follow coding conventions. There's even an article there about how to debug your software, so visual ways to debug your software. And then, of course, how to write a research paper last. So just some more resources in case you're interested later on. Are there any questions about literature surveys before we actually start? Does anybody feel like they're succeeding in their literature search? Does anybody feel overwhelmed by the volume of previously published literature? Does anybody ever pick up a research paper and think, is this relevant to my literature survey or not? So these are all topics that we discuss in the training series, some of which we'll discuss today as well. Yeah. And if you have questions like that, feel free to interrupt and ask questions as well. So let's see. I should probably start. So this is kind of an overview of this presentation. It's broken down into two phases. There's a preparation phase, kind of, for writing a literature survey, and those are all the things you do before you start writing your literature survey. So we're going to talk about like why literature surveys are interesting and why we write them, the challenges associated with literature surveys. We're going to discuss something called scope, and how to search for papers. And those are all like preparation phases. Those are all things you do before you start writing. And then there's actual writing. So there are ways to write contributions. What does your literature survey contribute, for example? We're going to discuss this topic called field challenges. So challenges associated with the topic you're studying. And we're going to look at literature classifications. This is one of my favorite topics. Thank you very much. This could be its own seminar, probably, just this topic. And then we're going to look at some examples from computer science. This presentation is for a general scientific audience. So I have examples from physics, mathematics, bioscience, and geography. Probably we won't look at those today in this. But if anybody's interested, we can. And then we're going to discuss some metadata and subsections. So why are we here? Why are we discussing literature surveys? So this is usually a starting point for a PhD or a master's degree by research. Step one is to write a literature survey. Does anybody know why we write literature surveys generally? Why is this a standard practice?
To support the final research that we are aiming to do, and to make the final research more evidence-based, and to support the final paper.
That's right, to support our publications. That's definitely true.
Because we need a chapter 2 and also gap analysis.
Yep, we need a chapter 2 and gap analysis. Yep.
Identify knowledge gap, and
Yep.
like you say, familiar yourself with the actual topic or field of research.
That's right. That's right. In the way I would phrase that is we want to identify both solved and unsolved problems related to our studies. So we're trying, a PhD theoretically contributes solutions to previously unsolved problems. So if we want to discover unsolved problems, we have to know what the solved problems are, basically. So we're creating this search space, or this space of solved problems in the literature. And hopefully, if we do that in a clever way with a good strategy, it will point us to knowledge gaps, as Edmund said, or unsolved problems. So the ultimate goal is to identify the solved and unsolved problems related to your research in whichever direction. So we want to determine solved and unsolved problems. And we have some hurdles in front of us. The very large volume of previous literature. And this is one of the biggest problems that faces all of science, every scientist, right? This was identified as one of the top challenges, the literature explosion. And back in 1999, So this has been around forever and it's not going away. And then the question is, how can we navigate through this massive complexity and how can we determine unsolved problems to work on? These are two of the central questions that we're going to discuss, hopefully, today. So some of the more specific questions that a literature survey can address or answer are what has been published so far? How have certain studies built on previous ones? In other words, how do the previous research papers relate to one another? Are they related at all? Are there any unsolved, or let's say, opinions that are not necessarily, with no consensus has been found? Have pathways of future research already been suggested? So there are some research papers, well, lots of research papers that actually suggest fruitful future research directions, and those are obviously good to have a look at. You can also think of how will your literature survey make a unique contribution. Now, this is not really standard practice necessarily. So the way I'm presenting this material today, it's as if you intend to publish your literature survey. That is certainly not true about everybody. At Swansea, we try to actually publish our literature surveys, and we'll talk about that more. But that's not necessarily a requirement. But you might hear me talking about publishing and how will your survey contribute, make a unique contribution, and that's with the intention of publishing in mind. Which methodologies have researchers used and which appear to be best, and who are some of the key leaders in your field? And then, of course, how does your topic fit into the larger context of previous work? So if you can answer all these questions already, you're kind of an expert already. Yeah, so this is kind of a goal, sort of overall, overarching goal. Maybe by the time you're finished with your PhD, you'll be able to, answer all those questions with confidence. So it's a great way to get an overview of the literature, identify solved and unsolved problems, and we're talking from this perspective of actually trying to publish it, right? In Swansea University, where I work, we've published a lot of literature surveys. Does anybody know some of the benefits of publishing a literature survey?
Does it save other or future prospective students the massive work reading through all the literature?
Definitely. Literature surveys are a great contribution, a great scientific contribution to any field. That's definitely true. Any other reasons?
Attracting citations?
Yes, that's you cheating, but that's true. So the most highly cited papers tend to be survey papers. So if you want to increase your citation count, you can publish surveys. Any other reasons?
It mostly helps in our own research that we are doing. It makes our research enhanced. Like we will get to know our scope very well after doing the critical literature review.
Definitely. It enhances your education, essentially. So in a number of ways. You'll get feedback from reviewers, like the previous speaker mentioned. Imagine you submit it and you get feedback. The reviewers are going to say, you missed this paper, this paper, this paper, this paper, and suggest improvements. So it's going to raise the quality of your thesis. It's also going to make your thesis better. It's going to raise the quality of your thesis. It's going to make your examination easier too, because the higher the quality of your thesis, the easier your examination is.
Yeah, like Bob as an authority in the field, can you publish this?
Yeah, so I have a lot of experience in this area. That's why Edmund invited me.
If I publish like a literature review, and automatically people think, oh, this guy should be.
Oh. That's right. So that asserts your authority. That's how you gain authority in a field. If you publish a survey, you are then recognized as an expert in that field. So the number of paper review requests that you get will skyrocket, and all these other things. Yeah, you will like get a name for yourself on the scientific map, so to speak, in that field. That's another great reason. So these are difficult, though. So it sounds great, but this is not easy. That's the drawback. It's difficult. So what are some of the challenges we have to face if we do this, right? The volume of previously published literature, which is very big. Choosing a starting point, how to start. So that's actually what we're here for today, is to try to provide a starting point. This is very difficult. Where do you start? That's a very difficult question. Deciding on a topic. This is also known as scope. It's very, very closely related, and I have a special slide talking just about scope coming very soon. We need to know how to perform our search, like the mechanics of actually searching, where to search, and how to navigate individual papers. So you have a paper in your hand and you're trying to assess, is it good for my literature survey or not? What is the most essential information I need to extract from this paper? That's actually the subject of another lecture. I have a special lecture just on that topic, if you want to check it out on the YouTube playlist. It's called How to Read a Scientific Research Paper. It's just this topic. We won't be able to go into details on that today because it's too much material. One of my favorite topics, deriving a classification of the literature. So that is putting the literature into different groups, creating clusters of related papers, and then relating the clusters to each other somehow. That's a fun exercise. And then ultimately determining the unsolved problems. So these two are connected. If you're very careful with your literature classification, it will point to unsolved problems in your field, and we'll talk about that. Sound interesting so far?
Yeah.
It sounds too good to be true, doesn't it? I just mentioned it's difficult. Like literature, surveys are difficult. So deciding on a topic. This is also deciding on the scope. This is very tricky, deciding on a scope. So a scope is basically a measure of breadth. How broad of a topic are you trying to do a literature search on? That's the scope. But you can literally think of a scope. This is something you're going to need to think of very, very carefully, and there's no way around it. You have to discuss this with your supervisor. Right? Don't try to do this without talking to a supervisor. Like that will be erroneous. So choose a scope that you think is too narrow to start with, right? And then you can broaden it if you discover that it's too narrow. What usually happens in practice is that a student or a researcher will choose a scope or a topic that's too broad, and they will discover that there are too many papers fitting inside that topic, and they will get overwhelmed by the volume. So choosing a scope is really very, very important. I'm trying to think of a good, an example from data visualization might just be something like visualization of surfaces. right? If you try to do a literature survey on the visualization of surfaces, and then you type that into Google Scholar, for example, that scope is too broad. You'll return thousands of papers addressing this topic. So then you need to take a step back and say, okay, I need to make this more narrow. How can I make this more narrow? And again, you talk to your supervisor. You could say something. You could add some constraints. For example, visualization of time-dependent surfaces. You could try it again and see how many hits you get. This is also going to be too broad, by the way, as a topic. So you'd have to narrow it even further. For example, like visualization of time-dependent isosurfaces, so a very specific kind of surface. Or visualization of time-dependent flow surfaces, or something like that. And then you get something that's narrow and a manageable scope. Right? It's a very, very common problem, this one, is choosing a scope that is too big and too broad. So do a preliminary search using things like Google Scholar and the IEEE Explorer library. And then if you get too many matching papers, you need to think about how to narrow the scope. Yeah. So I'll throw in some numbers. In my opinion, it's good to aim for 20 to 25 research papers that you know fit in your scope to start with. And as you summarize those and as you work through those papers, you will discover that actually there are more than 20 to 25 that fit into your scope. And it will get bigger. And see if you can limit it to 50 papers. Like that's at least some target to aim for. Like a literature survey that encompasses roughly 50 research papers. That's a good starting point. Yeah. And this is per student supervisor pair. Right? It's the scenario is a PhD candidate, for example, and a supervisor working together. You'll see sometimes literature surveys that have more than 2 authors or co-authors. Sometimes there's a team of 4, and if there's a team of 4, you can make it bigger. Right? And does anybody know what the world's most cited survey paper is? There's a theoretical physics survey paper that surveys all the subatomic particles, and it has hundreds of co-authors on it, and it's thousands of pages, right? So they don't follow these rules exactly, but they have a team of hundreds of authors on there, right? And also, don't forget to search for existing surveys. So hopefully during your literature survey exercise, search exercise, you're looking for other surveys. Somebody might have already published a survey on your topic, right? And then you have to get creative. But this also tells you, oh, what does a good survey look like? It serves as a role model. And as part of the writing, you actually include the scope, a description of the scope in the introduction of your survey. So that's part of the writing. So this is part of the preparation and the writing process. Any questions about scope? It's difficult. Scope topic is difficult because it's difficult to choose the how narrow it should be and how broad it should be. It's always this question.
Scope means title, right? Scope is limited to title of the critical.
The title should indicate the scope. Yes, the title should. Yeah, the title can be a concise statement of the scope. Yeah. For example, a survey of literature on time-dependent isosurfaces could be, and that will tell you the scope as well. Did I answer the question? Any other questions about scope? It's tricky. It's tricky. It's not like something you. So like, scope is a discussion. You have a discussion about scope that sometimes lasts months. Like it's you try something, then you see how many papers fit into that scope. Usually it's too many, and then you have to iterate and narrow it down more, and then iterate and narrow it down more. So sometimes we have discussions of scope that lasts months in Swansea, for example. It's not just a quick, like, black and white decision. Where are you looking? You know, you have to know where to look. I think probably everybody in this audience, this is not a big question about where to look for your literature. Two very popular digital library literature sources are the IEEE Explore Library and the ACM Digital Library. And I'm guessing Cardiff Met has access to those libraries. Is that true, Edmund? Yeah. Anybody else have popular libraries that they like to search?
Science Direct.
Science Direct, yep. Google Scholar is another good one. Probably I've forgotten one. ArchiveX is a popular one for physics and mathematics and so on. Most disciplines will have their own corresponding digital libraries. So if you had you know, if your topic was outside of computer science, you'd have a different set of digital libraries. And by the way, you look for related papers in the related work section and the references sections of the important papers that you find as well. So you search the digital libraries, but then you look inside the related work section and at the references of those papers you identify as being in scope. Everybody knows about Google's Cited By feature. So you could put the title of a scientific research paper into Google Scholar and then hit an option that says Cited By, and all the papers that cite that paper will appear in a list, or most of them. So that's a very good feature to use when doing your literature search. And you include a description of how you found your literature again, in the introduction of your survey. There's a paragraph called Literature Search Methodology, and you describe the search terms you used, how you searched, where you searched, how many papers you found, where you found them, and so on. Any questions about searching? Now, if you want to write a good introduction to your survey and you want to publish it, you want to think about contributions. What does your literature survey contribute to science, for example? And this goes into the introduction and motivation section 2. So some typical contributions of a literature survey. It could be the first literature survey of the topic you've chosen. So you may have chosen a topic, and you might be the first one ever to work on a literature survey of that topic. That's a nice contribution, right, to be the first person doing that literature survey. Another typical contribution of a literature survey is a novel classification. We haven't talked about that yet, that's coming. But you can introduce ways to organize that literature that identify the solved and unsolved problems. Or you could also say the mature areas where a lot of work has been done, and the less mature areas or the immature areas where very little work has been done. And another contribution is it could serve as a valuable starting point for anybody that's new to the field, but also experienced researchers that want to have a nice reference of field. And by the way, your survey doesn't have to be the first on this topic. You can publish newer versions or updated versions of previous surveys. So somebody else may have published a survey on your topic that's 10 years old, and you can publish a new version or an updated version. That's totally fine. Absolutely nothing wrong with that. And that happens frequently, actually. So that's something to consider. This is something that is kind of a standard part of the writing process, also in the introduction of your literature survey. What are the challenges that are special in the field that you are studying? Like what are the technical and scientific challenges? What makes your field interesting? What are the unsolved problems? In other words, generally, on a general level, like a very generic level. So some very generic examples that you'll see over and over again, right? Size and complexity of data, right? Most fields are facing this challenge because our ability to store and archive data is way better than our ability to derive useful knowledge and insight from it. So there's always this gap, right? So size and complexity of data is always increasing, and it's always outpacing our ability to really process it. Heterogeneous data sources is a technical challenge common to many, many fields, right? Many, many disciplines. Errors and uncertainty associated with data, any sort of measurement or measuring equipment. Again, this is for a more general, that's a more general scientific principle rather than just computer science. This can be a big challenge for people working outside of computer science, people in chemistry or bioscience or physics that have very expensive equipment. Anybody here have very expensive equipment? Computing equipment is
In the robotics lab, we got very expensive robots.
Okay, yeah, robotics will have the challenge of costs, yes. So I haven't done robotics, but yes, I can very well imagine that you have this challenge of expensive things, expensive hardware in robotics. And limitations of existing hardware or software are always challenges. These are just some examples, generic examples, to give you some flavor of what it is that goes in that part of the challenges. Your challenges can be described more specifically. You could take these and make them more specific to your particular problem or your field. Okay, so we'll start to talk about the literature classification. So when you start to collect papers, related papers, you want to figure out a way to organize them somehow. So you have a big stack of maybe 50 papers, and it's not very helpful. It is helpful, but let's say it's of limited helpfulness if you just present them in your literature survey as a list of 50 papers. It's still helpful for the next person down, so to speak. But you want to try to put them in groups, like which papers are related to each other and why are they related to each other. And that's called developing a literature classification. And this is also challenging, by the way, developing a nice, well-defined literature classification. And a discussion on literature classification can also take a long time. It can take several months. For some, we've discussed literature classifications for a year. That's how much we love that topic. This is just an example of a survey. The survey is called Visualization for the Physical Sciences. It has more than just one PhD student and a supervisor. It has 2 PhD students and 2 supervisors and then some extras thrown in there. Each colored rectangle is a paper that's described in the literature survey, and then they're put into these different groups. Along the x-axis you have different topics. One's astronomy, one's chemistry, one's earth sciences, one's physics. So the papers naturally fit into one of those topics. And then on the y-axis you have the dimensionality of the data being studied. So the data is either two-dimensional or volumetric, 3D, and it's either static or time-dependent. So it's subdivided twice by data characteristics. So 2D static data, there's only one astronomy paper that works with 2D static data. And there are no chemistry papers there. That's how to read that table. And we worked on this classification for a while, but you can see where the mature areas are, where a lot of work has been done. So here, there's been a lot of work done. So in physics, in volumetric time-dependent data for physics, there's been a lot of visualization work done. And because we have this two-dimensional classification, it opens up the holes. So we can see holes. Here's a big hole, right? Nobody's done work in here. So therefore, the barrier to entry is a little bit lower there to publish, right? You're more likely to do something novel here than here. If you're trying to do something novel here, it's very challenging. It's much more challenging. Right? You have a lot of predecessors. So developing a classification like this can be very, very helpful. Does everybody see that? Like some areas are mature and some areas are open. This happens to be nice because there are some literally completely open areas that you can make a contribution to. So deriving a literature classification is a major challenge of writing a survey. Using data as one of your dimensions, data dimensionality is a very typical way to classify a typical axis or a typical dimension by which you can feel free to use that one if you think it's appropriate for your topic. So a classification categorizes each research paper such that similar papers end up in the same group. So all those papers have similar characteristics, or they have some things in common if they end up being in the same group. So the categories are often based on subtopics within a larger topic. Look for reoccurring themes. So some themes coming up over and over again. And data and metadata attributes. So you can usually classify literature based on the characteristics of the data being studied, if you happen to be studying a topic that involves data. Usually there's some data involved. So some questions to ask yourself are, what are some of the themes or topics that occur over and over again? Because once you start your literature search, you'll see, oh wow, I've seen this topic before, it's appearing over and over again. Are there any natural subject-based clusters? So you can look for topics that reoccur and subjects that reoccur, and there are software tools that can actually help you do this. Right? You don't have to do it necessarily by hand. One of the tools is called Surveys. It's a free tool, and it can help you identify topics that keep occurring over and over again. What are some of the characteristics that most, if not all, papers you search for have in common? Like, for example, commonality in data or different types of data. And yes, since we study data visualization, it's a very common classification category for a lot of our literature surveys. Very tricky topic. Okay, so in the interest of keeping with the schedule, I'm gonna wrap up. This is just a screenshot of Surveys, the tool I just mentioned. So if you actually want to use, and this is not the only tool that helps with literature surveys. There's one called Mendeley. Anybody heard of Mendeley? That will help you. Yep, and there are more. I don't know all of them. I can tell you there's a list of them in the How to Write a Visualization Literature Survey that I pointed out earlier on. And there are some more examples here and some more discussions, but we don't really have time for all this stuff. What I'll do basically is just end here with this is a kind of an outline of what your introduction can look like for your survey. So introduction and motivation, 1.1 challenges, 1.2 survey scope, search methodology, then an overview of your classification, any metadata that you studied, and then you have the actual paper summaries in section 2. If you want like further references and further information and like a longer version of this talk, for example, you can look on the playlist. The playlist here has longer versions that of this talk. Yeah. Any questions to conclude?
It's just so for some good journals, they normally expecting good review or survey papers from well-established research groups or some big guys.
Yeah.
So which is a little bit tricky for early stage researchers to propose some literature review papers and submit it to journal. And some journals, they do request this kind of papers to be submitted to the editor board directly instead of the regular submission route, to be assessed first by the editor-in-chief or some senior members in the editor board. So I just want to know any tips or any kind of suggestions to be given to the early stage researchers to prepare this kind of paper.
Yep. There are kind of two options that I can imagine. But for the option you're talking about, where you want sort of a high impact journal,
yes.
a survey and a high impact journal, which is very difficult. If you feel like there's a knowledge gap or a gap in your knowledge, it may be a gap in your supervisor's knowledge, and you both as a team think, okay, this is outside of our comfort zone, you can team up with somebody else that is an expert. And I do that all the time. So if I recognize that this is an area that's outside of my domain and outside of my radar, I will look for somebody that's going to help. You know, I'll go to a conference and I will try to find somebody that is very knowledgeable in that domain. So for example, I just supervised a student that studied the visualization of molecular dynamics simulation data. And this was outside of, the first time you ever supervise a topic, it's generally outside of your expertise. And so an alternative is to find an expert. So I looked at some of the existing surveys in that area, and I saw some names that were appearing repeatedly, and those people are very knowledgeable in the field. And I went to the major conference in the data visualization field, and I thought, okay, I have to look out to see if I can meet this person, for example, and then introduce myself, and then say, look, would you help us with the literature search and the literature survey on this topic? I got very lucky one year, and I was just sitting down at a conference dinner, and the person I was looking for sat right across the table from me, like literally. I was like, I looked at his name tag, and I'm like, oh, I want to talk to you. And that conference had like more than 1,000 people at it. It was a big conference. So that stuff happens pretty frequently, actually. It's not that rare.
A quick question, like you talk about full literature survey paper, and you also have a literature survey section in every paper that you write. So how do you condense a big one to a small area?
That's a new question. So what I found that when I was a student, I learned how to write these surveys when I was a PhD student, because I was very lucky to have a supervisor that was very enthusiastic about this idea. But what I found when I wrote my literature survey is, wow, this thing is such a great resource. I'm going to know exactly which papers go into the related work section of all the papers that I write in the future on this topic. So it actually serves as an extremely valuable resource. So you don't have to like do extensive searching. That's part of the idea. It's one of the benefits. Is once you've done the literature survey, you don't have to do any more extensive searching for the related papers in the paper that you're working on now, because they're already in your survey. So to resolve that sort of tension, let's say, between the big literature survey and a research paper, you would write a sentence or two that says at the beginning of your related work, for a complete survey on this topic, you cite yourself. And that shows the referee that you've done your homework and that you do have an overview of the field. And then you discuss the only those papers that are really specific to your focus.
I like your answer. If you have 5 sections, you can write 5 papers.
Exactly, yes, yes, yeah.
So thank you very much, Robert, and let's show our appreciation. Yeah, we have stretched yourself a little bit when we set up the next presentation. So this is a final chance to grab any snacks, tea, coffee. Lunch will be coming.